Hello and welcome. I am happy to introduce you to yet another session of the NPTEL course, The History of English Language and Literature. In today's session, we shall be looking at prose in the Victorian Age, having already taken a look at the poetic output of the period. When we try to look at the emergence of the prose essays from the early times onwards, we notice that the Romantic period or the 18th century witnessed a considerable advancement in the field of English essay writing. And that was also the time when it was brought to our attention that the Romantic period contributed to the rise of the personal essay, the personal ideas being more important than all other times in the English literary history. In the Victorian period, we find a continuation of this new impact, which was the foundations of which was laid in the Romantic period onwards. But however, there is a significant departure from the personal essays towards more social criticism. Because in the Victorian period, it was no longer possible to remain aloof to the dominant socio-political events of the times, and in that sense, the writers begin to respond to the socio-historical problems, though it also had a personal tinge to it. So, overall we begin to see the result that the Victorian essay was dominated more by social criticism than by personal essays which were getting published in the periodicals from the 19th century onwards. If we try to look at the general features of the prose which was getting published in the Victorian period, it is important to note right at the beginning that the didactic essays and the social commentaries topped the list. There were a lot of essays getting published on various topics and subjects such as politics, society and environment, and there was also an increased audience and interest in historical tracts. So, we find many of the writers of this period resorting to a lot of historical writing. Some of them were accurate historical tracts and some of them only relied on a lot of imagination and a lot of hearsay to produce some kind of a historical writing. This was also the time of a lot of polemical writings on social issues. For example, we find many of these writers talking and writing about the problems of the working class. Polemical essays also included a lot of debates and a lot of argumentativeness built into their structure of the essay. This period, keeping in tune with the Victorian temper and the Victorian spirit, also encouraged a lot of critical thinking in these essays. It was impossible to engage with any topic without being critical or without being rationally sensible about it. So, this is the significant departure that we note from the early times, that it was no longer possible to just give a personal opinion, but one had to present it through a rationalized argument, and also had to be quite aware of what is happening in and around the socio-political ambience. And needless to say, this period also contributed to a lot of development about writings on art and architecture, and this was also the time when the literary critical writings were getting further advanced and further refined. Some major catalysts which propelled the writing of the polemical essays in the Victorian period, they also remain central to understanding of Victorian literature in general. They include the improvement in the advancements in the field of science. It was a age which was characterized by a significant move towards democracy. There was also a lot of religious and social unrest because of the various things which were happening, the prominent one being the publication of Darwin's hypothetical arguments. There was also many-sided interest and conflicting elements which completely had taken away the center or the foundation from the many belief systems that the English people held. The most important prose writer of this period is Thomas Carlyle. He is one writer who had sprung straight from the rugged Scottish peasantry. In that sense, we continue to notice a relationship between the Scottish writers and the English writers and the ways in which both continue to inform each other. We notice the beginnings of this from the period of the Scottish Enlightenment onwards, if you recall. Carlyle was one writer whose personality also underwent a radical change as and when the age progressed. We find him moving away from the doctrines of Calvinism based on which he was raised. His parents also had it in mind that he would eventually enter the Scottish church, but however radical changes in his religious views made him to come to this decision to not to enter the Scottish church or not to pursue a religious career. The work that brought him to much prominence in the Scottish circles was the publication of the Life of Schiller in 1825. This ensured that he had a promising literary career ahead. In 1826, he married Jane Welsh, and following which he also published the most important work of his lifetime, Sartor Resartus. By 1834, he made a decision to move to London, and after that also we find him continuing to be a very important figure in the English literary circles. In 1837, he published a work titled The French Revolution, followed by a compilation of his lectures on heroes and hero worship, which was published in 1841. And talking about the lectures, this was also a time when the public and even the academicians were identifying a lot of interest in listening to the eminent people of those times. Many of those people who were giving lectures were also later compiling it and publishing it so that it could reach a fairer and a wider audience. His work, The Past and the Present, was immensely inspired by the critical social and industrial conditions of those times, which were not really promising but were mostly bleak in nature. He also showed an immense interest in historical writings. In 1845, he published the Letters and Speeches of Oliver Cromwell. This was also a time when the English public in general was more interested in knowing the historical past which had brought the nation forward. The other important works of Carlyle include latter-day pamphlets, The Life of John Sterling and the History of Frederick the Great. We find him oscillating between historical writings and biographical sketches. And significantly, though he lived in an era which was also the high point of art, he spoke contemptuously of art as an art form, and he had no patience for the bookish side of literature. So needless to say, he was in stark contrast with the pre-Raphaelites who believed in art for art's sake. He also was not very happy about the turn of events which were dominating the 19th century. He denounced scientific materialism and its utilitarianism, which also became the founding principles on which Britain had placed much of its theory of advancement. And more importantly, he had no faith in democracy. In his own words, it was the last word of political unwisdom. So overall, we find him being hopelessly pessimistic, and that was not a very surprising thing given how gloomy the Victorian period was. And it said about Carlyle's influence that he could not indeed turn back the currents of his age, but it would not be easy to exaggerate his influence upon it. Remaining quite aloof from many of the things which were happening and also having rather unconventional ideas about art, literature and even about the political ideals of democracy, it's not surprising that he failed to impact the audience in a way that he hoped to. In 1866, he loses his wife, and we do not find him recovering from the grief that had resulted on him, and he died in 1881. And talking about Carlyle's influence, it's important to note that he was not very popular during his lifetime, but there is a canonical and historical as well as a literary critical interest that has been formed on his writings and his ideals at a later point of time. So Carlyle rises into eminence as part of major English literary history only at a later point when literary histories began to be written in a more structured and a more concerted form. The second significant prose writer of this period was John Ruskin, who lived from 1819 till 1900. He also began to show signs of early success right from 1839 when he won the Newdigate Prize at Oxford, and he was a brilliant student, and he was also quite commended for the publication of Salsette and Elephanta. And in 1843 he again got an early start with the publication of the first volume of his Modern Painters. It has already been brought to our attention that Modern Writers was a work that heavily defended the work of the pre-Raphaelites, and also that Ruskin was one of the major influences and the major inspirations for the pre-Raphaelite poets. And in this work, The Modern Painters, we find him trying to vindicate the genius of Turner and also trying to expound the true principles of landscape painting. And he also came up with successive volumes which were positioned at various intervals. In most of his writing career, Ruskin was occupied with architecture and painting and not really with literary arts. And some of his works do exemplify this important trait of his. His works titled The Seven Lamps of Architecture, The Stones of Venice and The Two Paths were mostly about the art and architecture of those times, and also giving voice to the many different and the unconventional opinions that he had. Later in his life, we find a shifting kind of an interest in Carlyle's life. We find him focusing more on the study of social conditions and also developing an interest in the practical problems of his own day. And his inspiration being Carlyle, we also find him trying to focus more on giving a kind of practical solution to the difficult times of the day. So we do see that it becomes almost impossible for most of the writers of this time to remain distanced from the pressing issues of the society. They also think that it's also their responsibility to respond to the times with practical and pragmatic solutions. Eventually, in John Ruskin, we identify a transformation of the art critic into the philanthropist and the reformer he is best known as in his later years. Ruskin also received many accolades to his credit. He was a Slate professor at Oxford. He continued to work in the area of history and theory throughout his life, but the focus of his work in the later stage, as we pointed out, was on social propaganda. And this conflicting interest, this complementing interest, is found in his works such as Unto This Last, Munera Pulveris, Time and Tide by Wear and Time, and Fors Clavigera is an exemplification of his move towards the interests of social propaganda. This is a series of letters written to the working men of England, exhorting them to any kind of positive and systematic action. His works such as Sesame and Lilies and The Crown of Wild Olives also try to exemplify these varying interests that he had towards the end of his career. Altogether, it would suffice to say that he was one among the very few who helped break down the tyranny of convention and tradition. He strongly believed that the artist must abandon altogether the stereotyped formalism of the schools, and instead of trying to paint like some famous master, must go straight to nature for himself, rejecting nothing, selecting nothing and scorning nothing. His call to reject nothing, select nothing and scorn nothing, it was a major influence on the pre-Raphaelite poets of the time, and we also, as we noted, we find him continuing to be a source of inspiration for many who wanted to follow the slogan art for art's sake. Though Ruskin shifted towards social and economic teaching, we do not find him getting any immediate success thereafter. He was even initially ridiculed as being hopelessly quixotic and also absurd, and we also find him denouncing the sordid spirit of modern commercial England and its idolatrous worship of wealth and material success. Some of these writers were real visionaries in beginning to identify the ugly turn of events that would perhaps overtake England in the 20th century, and they did not find many of these commercial turn of events being more promising as the rulers of the day thought. So, though Ruskin was a visionary, he failed to gain any kind of popularity during his lifetime, and again, as we noted earlier, some of these writers, they were brought back into the canon and they were reinstated because of the quality and the influence of their work even on the latter ages. Now, we look at the figure of Thomas Babington Macaulay, who was far more popular than Carlyle and Ruskin during his lifetime. It said about Macaulay that even his purely literary essays have been widely read by persons who as a rule never think of reading criticism. So, that was the kind of popularity that Macaulay enjoyed, and it said that every literate person in England had already read at least one piece by Macaulay, and they all used to thoroughly enjoy it. Macaulay had a brilliant academic record at Cambridge, and he opened his career through an essay on Milton that he published in the Edinburgh Review in 1825. If you recall, Edinburgh Review was one of the successful periodicals that were launched in the 19th century, which also had a significant impact on the Romantic writers as well. Macaulay was quite famous in the London literary circles. He made a reputation as a narrator and a statesman. He even eventually secured the position of a legal advisor to Supreme Council in India. This was between 1834 and 1838 that he served in colonial India. He is now also better known as the statesman who produced the now infamous Macaulay's Minutes of 1835, the event which also laid a very strong foundation to the establishment of formal English education in India. Today he is best known for his work, The History of England from the Accession of James II. This was initially published in 2 volumes in 1848, but he did follow up with 3 more volumes to make it a 5-volume history, and altogether the publication of this was over in about a decade. When we talk about Macaulay's writings, though he was hugely popular during his lifetime, there were many faults that we can identify in his style of writing and also in his content. He was whimsical, capricious, and had an irritating discursiveness about his writing. His temper was dogmatic, and his manner was very petulant and aggressive. And Hudson feels that he was writing as to stir the reader to a revolt. And there were also numerous and glaring inconsistencies in his writing, but nevertheless his thought and his phrasing was fantastic, which is why he also became quite popular in the Victorian period. In the early days of his career, we find him focusing more on the rich, ornate prose, and which also was a kind of exhibitionism that he resorted to because he had a very brilliant education and also had an excellent command over language. Towards the second phase of his writing, we find him resorting to an easy colloquialism. This also was peppered with a marvelous power for word painting. and this is what made him quite endearing to the reading public of those times. It's said that because of his popularity, that he had a marvelous faculty for making everything interesting, and it also seems that he rarely wrote a dull page. Whatever he wrote, even though it was inaccurate and it was inconsistent at times, he managed to make it very interesting for the common reader. And there is a kind of energy and a vivacious spirit and a picturesque element that we find in most of his writings. And in addition, Macaulay was also seen as a typical successful Englishman. He was also part of the colonial empire, and that also made him quite a preeminent person in London. And his writings and his viewpoints, in fact, it delighted the average man, and it said that Macaulay could successfully express the viewpoint of the typical average English man, and this he achieved without transcending any of the theories or any of the belief systems of the time, or attacking anything like most of the Victorian writers did. It was Macaulay's shallowness, as some critics feel, made it all the easier for them to understand them. So, one does not know whether it was the critical ability or the genius faculty of Macaulay which made him very popular, or whether it was his shallow spirit and his popular expressions which made him more endearing. Keeping in tune with the kind of popularity that he enjoyed, he also hated the vague and the mystical, and we also find him having a very firm faith in the happy materialism of his age, which many other writers had denounced as being ugly and also being quite detrimental to the future of the nation. Macaulay was not a great thinker. He was not a great literary critic either, and he also had a lot of inaccuracies in his work as a biographer and as a historian, but his achievements were so remarkable that it's almost impossible to now exclude him from the annals of literary history. The most important contribution of Macaulay is that his essays popularized a taste for literature, which also became quite foundational in the understanding and the reception of literature from the 19th towards the 20th century. The other important prose writers of this period include Henry Thomas Ibaka. He had written a history of civilization in England, and in this we also find a profound influence of physical sciences. We find that most of these writers, they were quite well read, that they also tried to bring in all these different disciplines into a single book. We also notice that this was the time when some of the writers were even trying to bring together these contradictory elements in order to give a very varied taste to the audience and to the reader. Edward Augustus Freeman was the author of The History of Norman Conquest. James Anthony Froude wrote A History of England from the fall of Wolsey to the defeat of the Spanish Armada. It was brilliantly constructed, it was also popular and hugely receptive, but at the same time it said that it had a lot of inaccuracies built into it. Samuel Rawdon Gardiner, he published a series of volumes on the period of the Stuarts and the Civil War. We find the English public hogging onto a lot of material on the historical past of England, and also trying to nostalgically look at the previous kings and the previous rulers and try and compare it with the Victorian gloom that had set in. William Edward Leckie was the author of the History of England in the 18th century. John Richard Green published Short History of the English People. This work was a very significant work in the field of history because the focus was not on the kings and the wars as the historical writings usually were, but the focus was more on the people. So this also marked a shift towards the writing of history as a history of the people and not just as a history of events or particular people who made it really successful. John Addington Symonds wrote the Renaissance in Italy, and this work is seen as a connecting link between history and aesthetic criticism. As the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood would suggest, there was a growing link and a growing connection between aesthetic arts and also between literary arts. And this was also the time when both of these differing kinds of arts were increasingly getting influenced by the political and social developments of the period. And for this to get reflected in the works of the time, it was quite a marvelous feat. Walter Horatio Peter is perhaps the best known among the minor writers of this time. He is considered as the most important writer after Ruskin in the field of aesthetic criticism. His important works include the Renaissance, Greek Studies, Imaginary Portraits, and Marius the Epicurean. He was also one of the very few who turned to the Renaissance for inspiration and were seen as quite an anachronism during their own lifetime because they relied heavily on the older medieval ideas than on the contemporary kind of inspirations. Sir Leslie Stephen authored Hours in a Library. It's considered as one of the best biographical studies available in the 18th century. It's considered as one of the best biographical studies available in the 19th century. Now we come back to Swinburne again, and he was also a prose writer, but his work is not considered with much importance by most of the literary historians and critics of the later times. In fact, Hudson continues to be quite unkind on the kind of productions that Swinburne made. He did write a great deal of criticism, but as Hudson would evaluate it, his enthusiasms and his prejudices alike were so violent that little confidence can be placed in his judgment. This is also perhaps the opportune time for us to remember that the reputation of the individual writer rests heavily on the canon making process and also on the literary criticisms which make its way into the general public. John Henry Newman was considered as the most dominating personality after Carlyle, and in his works we find theology also passing into general literature. So the Victorian times are a time when we find the amalgamation of many different ideologies and differing contesting items coming into contact with one another, and we also identify that he was the chief spokesman of the Oxford movement. It also becomes important to take a look at what the Oxford movement is. The Oxford movement was also known as Tractarianism. It originated in Reverend John Keble's sermon National Apostasy, which was also published in 1833. In this, Reverend Keble attacked the government's plans to de-recognize the Anglican Church of Ireland, and this had led to a lot of outrage from within the church, and they published 90 tracts altogether against the government's move, and most of these tracts, among the 90 tracts, it was written by John Henry Newman. And one of the arguments of Newman was that the Church of England derived its authority from being direct descendants of the apostles, and thereby one need to be quite careful while de-recognizing another church. And Newman's controversial tract was the final one, the 90th tract, and he argued that the 39 articles which distinguish the Anglicans from the Roman Church did not conflict with Roman Catholic ideas. If you remember, there was a point of time when England moved away from the Catholic Church and established its own Church of England. We also had taken a detailed look at the turn of political and social events which had led to this separation, following which England remained a Protestant nation with the Anglican Church as its official church, and now to de-recognize the Church of Ireland, it was not an easy move to make. And Newman's arguments further reiterated the fact that these 39 articles, which form the basis of the distinction between the Anglican Church and the Catholic Church, they were not radically different from each other, and accordingly the 39 articles could be even seen as Catholic. This was a very scandalous thing to say in Protestant England, and we even find Newman getting ostracized for proposing this idea. And eventually, as we noted earlier, Newman also leaves the Anglican Church and joins the Catholic Church. This also was the result of the many things which were happening in the Victorian period. Coming back to look at the other important figures of the time, John Richard Jeffreys wrote Gamekeeper at Home, The Amateur Poacher, and in these works we find an observation and description of nature. We also find him continuing the kind of ideals which were set from the Romantic period onwards. His work, The Story of the Heart, it's a very detailed account of the inner experiences that he faced as a person, and this also becomes important because the Victorian period was characterized by a lot of personal gloom and also personal distrust and personal dilemma which even the common people were facing. The final set of writers are quite important. Grant Allen, John Tyndall and Thomas Henry Huxley were famous scientists of the Victorian period. They also had a commitment to bring science closer to the common people. So we find them making scientific subjects interesting to the intelligent general reader, and also talking about a lot of scientific principles and the scientific innovations which were hitting the headlines in the Victorian period. So altogether, when we try to survey the popularity and the interest that the people had on the essay form, on the prose form in the Victorian period, we begin to see that it was not just a literary product, it was also a writing which could bring together all the contesting notions and the contesting genres, ideals and disciplines of those times. And we also find this move leading towards the production of better and more well-formed essays in the 20th century. So with this, it's time for us to wrap up this session. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to seeing you in the next session.